let's talk about this. The results of the English election. Not good.
Not good. Very bad.
Not good. Very bad. The results, as far as I can tell, and again, I'm not. I don't wade too deeply into these things. Are the worst it's been for the Labour Party in decades, since Margaret Thatcher, and I know that was in the 80s, but I don't have the ability to do the math right now. I just my brain is too fried. 30 years, maybe a little more. The Conservative Party, led by Boris Johnson, 365 seats. Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn, 203 seats. Scottish National Party, SNP, 48. And the Lib Dems, 11 votes. 11 seats. And it's bad. Now, we should be clear that, I think that there's always a tendency for folks to sort of like over analyze the implications of an election here, and vice versa. I imagine if Corbyn had won, it would have, without a doubt, inspired those of us over here who support Bernie Sanders and maybe broadly the left, with the sense of like, this is moving to the, this is moving to the left. The point though is that, there's a lot of different sort of dynamics that are working in specifically in England right now around Brexit. But let's go first to this announcement by Jeremy Corbyn. His Lieutenant McDonnell is also, I'm not sure exactly what role he played in the party, but John McDonnell also has already pledged that he will step down as well. Jeremy Corbyn does as well. This was this morning, I guess, today, London time, but last in the morning, our time, last night.
I want to also make it clear that I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign. I will discuss with our party to ensure there is a process now of reflection on this result and on the policies that the party will take going forward. And I will lead the party during that period to ensure that discussion takes place and we move on into the future.
So there it is. Corbyn stepping down. And I think the reality is that according to YouGov, Corbyn's favorability was underwater by about 40 points. I think 21% positive versus 61% negative. Labour's major planks, however, the wealth tax had a 44% positive favorability. Nationalization, 34%. Corporate reform, 33%. Very popular. And I'm not saying 33% support. I'm saying the differential. And I think when you combine that with not just how Labour's leadership dealt with Brexit, but also just the challenge that Brexit itself represented to the Labour coalition was difficult. Here is Owen Jones explaining why Labour was split by the Brexit vote, right? You can talk about that it was the way it was handled by Labour's leadership was not great, because there was like literally years of sort of not picking a side.
They waffled.
But I think the point that that Jones makes here is that, like, this was a damned if you do, a damned if you don't situation. I suppose you could argue, if you're gonna, the best time to try and, we used to say this in college, like, the best time to fall behind on your work is early, so that you have time to catch up. And maybe, if you're faced with a decision that's not going to work either way, but I don't know that anybody could have predicted 2 years ago that 2 years later you still wouldn't have any type of clear resolution one way or another to Brexit.
There was never any momentum toward Remain either, which ultimately doomed him.
And I think that's what people anticipated would happen. There was definitely a sense, I think, that, like, once people get a taste of what a cluster F this is, but I think sort of the opposite happened, which is just like, there's only one way to end this, and that is, let's just get out of the EU and let the chips fall where they may. Here's Owen Jones.
Did anyone slam the door in the face of people like myself and others because they said, well, actually, we don't support public ownership of utilities, or we don't think rich people should pay more tax, we don't think there should be more investment in services, we don't think tuition fees should be scrapped? No one did. That just never happened. I wish I had an answer. I was one of those who didn't support a second referendum and thought, even though I didn't like the referendum result, we had to make it work. And so they had to pivot to support a new referendum, even though people like me were reluctant to support that. I thought that was the only alternative. But I think the two things that have caused this result tonight are that, even though it's true, and this has been pointed out by political scientists, that most Labour voters are Remainers by a large degree, Labour can't win without the Leave wing of its electoral coalition, and they have defected Labour en masse tonight. It is true that in Leave seats, most Labour voters are Remainers. But it's also true that if the Leave contingent of that coalition defects, then they will lose those seats. Yeah. And that has happened in seats that Labour have represented for decades. I know people go, you're just making excuses about Jamie Corbyn, that comes up more on the doorstep. But from my experience, and if we think back to 2017, when Jamie Corbyn's Labour Party enjoyed the biggest increase in Labour's vote share since 1945, going from 30% to 40%, my very distinct impression on the doorstep and travelling the country is the fall in support, and very acute support for Jamie Corbyn, had a lot to do with Brexit, in that he was seen as weak and indecisive. Did I think that was fair? No, because I thought Labour had an impossible hand on Brexit. But because Labour was so obsessed with not leaving their Leave wing, and you can see why they were worried about it, they struggled for many, many months, if not longer, to come up with a coherent, settled Brexit position. And in that time, people thought they were weak and indecisive and unable to speak on the main issue facing the country. But I still don't know what they were supposed to do, given that most of their supporters were Remainers and were defecting from them, and yet they couldn't win without their Leavers. I don't know what the answer to that is.
Sometimes there's situations that are no-win, and this may have been one of them. I just got this email, and look, anybody can email us. I tend to be a little more open to these emails where they're talking about experiences that I don't have. It's one perspective. Take it for what it's worth. Listener Robert writing, I've just seen the exit polls for a general election in the UK, and looking at the result that deflates all of us on the left in the UK, makes me worry more than ever that people are looking for economic reforms will continue to turn to the right-wing conservative government misguidedly, and the bro-wing of Labour will use this result to justify their policies and take Labour back to the centre-right after outing Jeremy and John. As someone who has moved from a staunch Labour stronghold to a swing seat in the Shores, I've spoken to all the regular people in my pub leading up to this election, arguing why a vote for Labour is a vote for their own self-interest. But I'm afraid the political smears of Jeremy have worked too well. People who backed him in the last election have turned their backs on him because of his interactions with the IRA before Good Friday agreement. I've rarely hear the anti-Semitic argument made. More a traitor to the country and its veterans. This is grass level support that he would need. That refuse to vote for him, even though policy-wise they agree with the entire labor manifesto. That's interesting. I had never heard that angle of it before. I don't know if it's true.
Seems to be related to the stuff around his nuclear trident policies or whatever.
I definitely believe that the people who voted Tory do not care about anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well.
I don't know everything there is to know about the UK, but it does seem like there is this real sick desire on the part of at least an electorally substantial portion of the working class to see these strong men, these right-wing authoritarians in leadership. And it's a function of so many things. It's a function of globalization and neoliberalism. It's a function of these bourgeois ideologies, namely racism, xenophobia, sexism, all that stuff. It's a function of the atomized societies in which we live, where these old institutions, these old community bonds are breaking down, and there's really nothing yet to replace them. And, I think the left should keep intervening in elections strategically. I'm not totally against it, but they also need to be building from the ground up these independent institutions to try to regrow these bonds in a real and multicultural way, like unions, tenants unions, neighborhood councils, mutual aid for migrants who are under attack, especially. We might need to have some sort of mutual aid set up for women's health in this country pretty soon. And, there are no shortcuts. And if we do that, I hope that we'll see it reflected on an electoral and legislative level.
Yeah. I also imagine, frankly, that once Brexit actually happens and things start to shake out in a way where that is no longer a sort of such a question mark and a source of anxiety, I think just that tension of what's going to happen, I think then is a time where you'll start to see some type of realignment because it's going to present new problems that will be fixed in terms of the context.
And I'd also say to anybody who is going to run into the arguments that Corbyn means Sanders is doomed, that the Brexit threat is entirely opposite to the Trump threat, and that the Brexit threat severs your liberals and leftists and workers in a way that Trump unifies them. So we're in completely different in terms of the main problem each election is trying to address. Yeah,
there's nothing. We have nothing. I mean, I suppose I could imagine a situation that would be analogous, but I don't know what it would be. I mean, if there was some major, I don't know. I don't even know. I mean, what they're talking about is a fundamental reorientation of where their country is. And it's, I think on some level, it's also a last grasp in sort of getting over the national, in their national psyche of how they identified themselves. And, in many respects, I imagine generationally speaking, the last of people who were alive and conscious and sort of part of England as an empire, as Great Britain. They are gone for the most part, and or just leaving, and so there's a whole new set of sort of cross currents of psychology. They're trying to determine, where do we fit in now? Now that we are no longer the country that, that defined our national psyche, our perception of ourselves has changed so dramatically. I don't know what an equivalent would be in this country. And certainly that would, and so I don't think it, I don't, I know that if he had won, there would be things to take from the left. It would be inspiring.
It would have been insane if he had won, because overcoming those odds based on it would have been the platform or something like that. When the platform can't make up that type of.
Right.
obstacle.
And I think people and just because people would have taken, I think, a lot of encouragement from a Corbyn win does not mean that a Corbyn loss has an equally as relevant meaning in this country. That does not necessarily follow, right? I mean, we experience these things all the time. If X happens, it's going to have a lot of implications. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of implications.
Yeah, we're very early in this cycle of struggle still.
And also even in this election.
Well, it's interesting. I used to always prefer the UK's election system where it was basically over in a couple of weeks. But I'm starting to think that like maybe because it seemed like the polls were trending in the right direction for Corbyn, which is why I think so many people were surprised. And I somewhat think that actually maybe it is a bit clarifying. And like if you would have had more time, I don't know, maybe not.
Who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, those polls, I don't know. They seem to have been pretty far off.
But there are a few reasons to be a little more optimistic about the electoral chances of left populism in the U.S. right now, including the demographics of this country. We have a lot more voters who are not white and who will not be voting for a white nationalist political party, no matter what. The press is handling it differently right now. The attacks on Corbyn were vicious and definitely hurt him, whereas the American press really isn't sure what to do with Bernie Sanders still. Like they're kind